Black mask, I'm a nuisance, pound and a plan, tryna be Bruce Wayne. I ain't slowed down since about last May, cause this grind don't sleep and I dream all day. And I'm far from sane, cursed with a gift, my only saving grace. Firstborn son and they think I'm crazy, till the sky falls and they see my rain. First thing, they don't know about the vision, no wonder why there's all eyes on me. Came from a place where the grass ain't green, so the blood, sweat and tears really stain my tea. And I can't find sleep, always awake, guess it ain't that deep. Everywhere I go, I'm just counting sheep, so I gotta lead the way like little Bo Peep on the kid.
England's semi-final loss in 2019 was viewed by over 11 million people in the UK. That's 17% of the UK's population. However, in this current season, only 24% of the season's games will be shown on TV. Where does the blame lie?
So I think that broadcasters don't do enough for women's sports because they think the interest won't be there. There's often this conception in sports that women just won't generate as much interest, or that women don't watch sports as much, and it's a huge misconception even when it comes to men's sports. People think that women simply don't watch it, or that they aren't interested, and this is even more prevalent when it comes to women's sports. So just even promoting women's sports, I've seen a few broadcasters do it even on social media, and if you look at the comments, so many of the comments will say no one cares, no one watches, and if you actually look at the numbers, people do watch it. And I think broadcasters simply not ignoring, but just not promoting women's sports or not showing them is a big disservice to the sport.
One of the issues why I personally feel that broadcasters don't do more for women's sport, or have not traditionally, is because of kind of the golden triangle, I call it, of sport, which is you've got elite sport, you've got sponsorship, and then you've got media. And because the viewership numbers may not be great, you can't get then sponsorship. Therefore, it's like, okay, why do we need people to see it?
In supermarkets, right, when they've got a new chocolate bar, for instance, to launch, what do? They put the chocolate bar right next to the till. You're switching on the TV and that chocolate bar is being advertised, and then you go into the supermarket to do your weekly shopping. You think, I've seen that. I tell you what, I'll try that one. It's right by the till right there. And what I would say is, if we're using that analogy in women's football, I don't think that we're putting women's football next to the till. I think it's there, but I think people have got to go down the aisles and they've got to try and find it. And I would even say that as far as I'm praising the FA player, I actually think there's a lot of people out there that don't even know it exists. I think there was a big thing around it when it first launched. And now I think people who already like women's football, who already would walk down the aisle to go and get their favourite food, are the ones that are using it. And what we need to do is get it by the till. And I don't think that's happened yet.
I think part of the problem is the perception of women's sport. There's this general agreement amongst broadcasters that there's no interest in it, and I think that's slowly and gradually starting to get proven wrong. It's difficult as well because of things like the FA player, where they're getting those things out there for free and to good audiences. It's now getting proven that there's an actually a worthwhile thing to do, and I think it's just going to take time and development. I think there is interest, but there's not enough interest from the public at the minute. Maybe it doesn't get the viewing figures. I mean, the big games do, but the smaller games really could do more as clubs to interact with these broadcasters and get more interest, I think.
Yeah, I also think there's so many stereotypes with women in sport still to this day. So I feel like people just aren't willing to give it a chance. Like, you hear so many people just write it off, just like, oh, well, they can't play like men and things like that. So without even giving it a chance, it just gets written off straight away. And I think big broadcasters are so aware of that. So they're like, if our viewers aren't going to give it the time of day, why should we?
I think that sometimes broadcasters are a little bit lazy. I think that we know that the Premier League and like the WSL will sell, I guess. And I think there's so many more interesting stories further down the leagues, on the men's side as well as on the women's side. So I think that sometimes it's just an easy thing to just go, okay, let's focus on the stars, let's focus on the names, let's focus on the brand. And actually I'm a little bit fearful as well for the future of women's football, because I think that there is a danger that in order for it to be glossy and slick, the only clubs that will be given any visibility will be those Premier League clubs. And yeah, sure, Lewis who? Are we going to see a cut of that? Will we see a slice of that despite all the efforts that we've put in and all the investment that we've put in? I think there's a big danger that in the future there'll be some kind of breakaway Premier League women's football system, and all of us, well, I don't know, we won't be a part of that. So I think there is a little bit of a danger there.
Always hear all the time is that, you know, football, women's football still got a lot of growth to do. It's not reached its peak yet. It's still something that we need to put a lot of investment in, which I think in some ways is fair enough, but it's a bit of chicken and egg, because if broadcasters don't get behind women's football and start showing it, how's it going to grow? So I think if I was, you know, sitting in BT's head office or Sky's head office, I would really want to be playing my part in making women's football more accessible for more people. Because one of the big issues that I have with going to watch games, I'm a big Arsenal fan. I've been down to watch Arsenal women play, but that is probably like at least a 2-hour round trip for me, and I live in London, and it's actually quite expensive for me to get there, and then there's quite a long walk for me to even get to the ground, and then you've got to think about coming back on a weekday. It's just not, you know, it's not doable. Sometimes even me getting there after work is not practical. So as much as I like attending live games, it's so much more accessible to show it to people through their TVs or online. So Sky and BT really need to do more.
It doesn't get enough coverage. It doesn't get enough coverage. You know, you look on, like, you can look on Sky, you can see, you know, Sky Sports Premier League, you can see Sky Sports Cricket, but you don't see a Sky Sports Women's Football. Like, it doesn't get the coverage, like, it doesn't get the time, it doesn't get the energy.
A lot of mainstream platforms tend to get a lot of male presenters in, a lot of ex-male sportsmen in, because it seems like to society they know more about the industry more than women do, and that's not necessarily the case. I think because for example, with men's football, it's getting watched more than women's football. There's a lot more money in it than women's football, so people just tend to attract more to the men's game, and that's probably why a lot of the mainstream media tend to get more men in. But I think there isn't a difference, really. I think if a man knows about the sport and a woman knows about the sport, they should be able to speak about it. At the end of the day, we all love it, and we're all watching the same game at the same time. So I don't see why there should be any sort of problems or why there isn't a good enough balance in terms of male and female.
I'll bring this example up because it's something that really did annoy me at the time. Match of the Day X were doing a preview for a FA Cup game, and they brought in a Love Island contestant who was a female to discuss Arsenal. And instead of kind of discussing things about the game, they were discussing, oh, which footballer would you like to kiss, who would you marry, etc. Which is kind of like, you can do a piece of content there. You could have had a female footballer that supports Arsenal come on, and you're talking about the game, she's showing her personality. You could have had a female football influencer, because there is loads of them, come on, talk about, okay, the big game, etc. And that's how you kind of create people's brands off the pitch. What they did was they had someone that knew a lot about football, because she spoke about football. She spoke about, I believe it was Ray Parlour, and then all you did was just kind of reduce and take away from the experience by saying, okay, oh, would you rather kiss Nelson or Bellerin? So yeah, I think broadcasters can do more, and I think that having a brand is so essential, because if we look at American sports, it's perfect. You don't just watch basketball because it's like, oh yeah, this guy got 3 points. You're watching it because you know Dame's saying loads of crazy stuff off the field. It's like, you know what, I buy into his character. I'm invested into his character, so I'm going to be invested to how he performed. And that's just for any sport. So women's sport should, well, broadcasting and entities need to help women's sport do the same.
I think one sport that does quite well with this is tennis. They've come to a place where women are valued as much as men, but they're still paid less. But broadcasters have really played up on that. So, you know, when Serena Williams is playing, they've broadcasted that and they show huge interest, and I think that other sports need to catch up, like football, and show as much interest. So when a community shield is happening or when a big league match is happening, I think it needs to be promoted in the same way that women's tennis is promoted.
100%. And also, I mean, we all love a rags to riches story, right? So when you hear some of their journeys, where they've come from, what they've had to do, the things that they've had to balance just to be able to get to the point that they're at now, it's inspirational. And I just think the issue is coverage. Like, you know, they've got such inspirational stories, but not enough people know about them. And that's why I go back to the point about the onus being on there being more coverage, and other organizations doing their part as well as the governing bodies within football, because I think there will be a lot more interest in the women's game when we get these stories out into the general public and wider knowledge ultimately.
In 2019, BBC's coverage of the Women's World Cup reached more than 28 million viewers. What impact did that leave on the women's game and women's football as a whole?
The past World Cup, obviously it was massive. I think we got the record-breaking views on like BBC in terms of the games that we had, but for me it went the previous World Cup, it was the one before that. I think it was the 2015 World Cup where our seniors won bronze. That's where the change happened, I think, in this country, and how it spiked in terms of being on TV, being on social media. I think people started to realise how big the game was getting and wanted to join in terms of the development and stuff. So the previous World Cup only just emphasised it and pushed it in the direction that it needs to be.
The Women's World Cup, I think the amount shared was around 12 million. 2019 was 24. That's double the jump in 4 years. So you can. It was good for England to finish third, you know, in the 2015 World Cup. No denying with regards to that. However, I do believe the 2019 World Cup, there was a bigger inclusion overall. There was not just an emphasis on England. Oh my gosh. If you watched the BBC and you watched the World Cup, like I always say, there was a lot of emphasis on Japan, and especially how Japan were playing, the style they were playing. You know, there was a breakdown into seeing how they were moving the ball. I don't know if you watched that World Cup. They were so comfortable in possession. And I'm looking at it, I'm just like, this wasn't the case that many years ago. You know, you're a male, you're switching on the TV, and you're saying, they're keeping the ball better than I am.
We can probably all say the 2019 World Cup, there was a lot more there was, like we were saying, it was a sellout basically. There was a lot more fans there. From 2015 World Cup, there wasn't really many. Going myself and seeing that there weren't really many there. Like to watching now, 2019 World Cup, there was tons. So yeah, it has, like I said, with the growth on it, you can see the difference from 2015 to 2019 now, which is 4 years. So there's a huge difference already. So hopefully in the next 4 years there's going to be a massive difference again.
I think the World Cup was really good for legitimising women's football. So it was on TV. You could accidentally come across it. You could switch on the TV, find yourself 45 minutes later engrossed in a game. Whereas if it's pay to view, or if it's it's on the red button, or you have to go search it, you can stream it. You have to go searching for it. So the World Cup was brilliant for legitimizing it, saying this is a product, you're interested, right? So now people are starting to understand that it's a legitimate space for their daughters to play in, or for their sisters to be involved in. What we need to do now is make sure that there's a knock-on effect on the sponsors and on the broadcasters to make them realize that this is a legitimate space for them to invest longer term. I do worry that when the next World Cup comes along, we'll be like, wow, this is a great product, women's football, isn't that cool? Gosh, never even seen this before. Because frankly, that's what it was like in 2015, and then it died out and came back up. So I think sometimes sponsors need to be a bit braver. And over in America, they've just finished their big national tournament, and some of the brands there were getting huge amounts of exposure because women's sports, the fans are quite loyal. So if they see a brand invest, they'll be loyal to that brand. And I think that loyalty is bigger than in other areas. But I don't think the sponsors are cracking on just yet. And that's because they're probably not all that diverse themselves.
As much as the larger broadcasters face scrutiny for a lack of coverage, what platforms have picked up the mantle to provide fans with necessary news, match reports, and statistics?
The podcast was born out of a frustration, really. Kate, Hayley, and I, we all worked at Sky Sports at the time. And I think we just started to recognise that there wasn't really an outlet for us having an opinion on football. There was a lot of outlet for us to be on screen and to be reading out auto cue, for instance, at that time. But there wasn't really much scope to really plough in with an opinion and really showcase our knowledge of football. But we used to, in the makeup chair, have chats when we were getting ready at Sky, just as friends, and we'd talk about football. And it was just something that I thought at that point didn't exist. Podcasts were starting to gather a little bit of pace. So I approached Kate and Hayley and said, would you like to have a bit of a roundtable discussion just about football each week? And we'll put it out as a podcast. And that's developed over the years into what the podcast is now. But from the humble beginnings, it was us three, and that was 2012, 2013.
Yeah, it was 2012, if not a little bit before that, when we started playing around with the idea. And I think we set it up never really wanting to prove a point, never really thinking that it was particularly going to do anything. It was more about just us having an outlet, feeling frustrated that perhaps we weren't being used for our opinions and our knowledge as much as we would want to have been. And it was, set up as a labour of love, quite hobbyist, always professional in our broadcasting, but it really was set up just out of frustration more than a need to prove a point or make a big statement. And it just started to develop this cult following. I think a lot of our industry friends listened to it, and then it started to sort of spread out a little bit in terms of audience reach. And also because this was the early days of podcasting, if you had people who were interested in podcasts, unlike now, there actually weren't a huge selection of them, and there were even fewer, women. And in fact, there were no women talking about football, and that was the case for kind of many, many years. But I think we stuck out because we weren't afraid to make the most of the fact that we were women, and that our analysis and our opinions were maybe going to be, in some ways, a little bit different to what you'd get from a pundit on the TV.
But I think also, just to give you some context as to what was going on in the industry at that time, it was right off the back of Andy Gray and Richard Keys being sacked by Sky, because they'd had quite a big story in the papers. It was huge news at the time that they'd been quite sexist with comments towards the Sean Massey, female lineswoman, and there were some other things that had been picked up as well when they'd been caught on microphone. And I think it was that feeling of colleagues. I mean, they were colleagues, especially for Hayley. I mean, Kate and I worked in a different department at the time, but you feel like you all work in the same building, and feeling like people that you're working with are thinking, oh, they don't really know what they're talking about. They don't know the offside rule, when they'd generalised and said women don't know. And I think that was the final catalyst, really, for us just to think, well, why not?
Her Football Hub is a global journalistic outlet. We cover all aspects of women's football, whether that be grassroots or the highest level. We've covered World Cups, and we've covered five-a-side women's football. Our aim is to showcase women's football, but more specifically women's footballers. So yeah, we'll cover things like the transfers, the high-profile moves, the big news. But what our passion is giving the women an outlet where people know who they are. We want to delve into their lives. We want to really make them characters. In men's football, at every level, everyone knows everything about the players. They're really personalities. They're celebrities. And in women's football, you don't really get that. Some of these women run care homes. Some of these women work in bars. Some of these women are lawyers. And they're doing all this alongside that as a passion. And the dream myself, my colleagues had, so Georgia Goulding is a journalist from Liverpool, and Taylor Kuava is a media mogul from America, a really talented guy. And the three of us, after covering the Women's World Cup, decided to get together and form the hub. And yeah, our real passion was to create celebrities out of women's footballers. They deserve it. They deserve their stories to be known. They deserve their sacrifices to be told. And that's what our passion is, and that's what we came to do.
Let's cover the WSL. And then after that, we thought, well, let's not just do England, let's do France, the US. You know, we cover Kenya as well now, and there's just no limits to how far we want to go with this. Tough to begin with, especially when you're trying to build a follow base, because when you've only got like 12 followers and stuff, it's hard because you feel like nobody's listening. But we have followers now who are just as lively on our feeds as they were in the first days. I could name them off on two hands. There's so many loyal people who've stuck with us, but it's that's what it is. It's a matter of separating these people who are men's football fans to people who are just football fans, and you do find them and they do stand out, and they're the ones who will be loyal to you and they will follow your content whether you're big or small. And I think that's the key thing, is that we've just had to find the right audience and stay away from the people who have got nothing but negative stuff to say.
I would say that from a women's football point of view, there's still a lot to be done. I think if you need the sort of stats, data, information that you would get, for instance, I'm a great example for this because I work in men's and women's football. So if I was going to prep for one or the other, where do I go? And I don't think I can get all of the resource that I need from mainstream media to try and find those stories, unless you are really, really switched on. It's like you've just said, you have to go to things like Her Football Hub or Girls on the Ball, or people that are niche and know about women's football, to go into their archives to find out. She Kicks magazine is a great resource, but there are not many of them around. And I also think that the mainstream media that are covering it, as much as they're making improvements and trying to do a good job, I still think it's cut money.
In a way, yes, there's a lot more to be done, and it will be resource driven. I think you've got to shout out someone like Telegraph Women's Sport, who for the World Cup in 2019 sent their best football reporters. They didn't send a women's football reporter, they didn't hire a freelance to do it, which is what normally happens. They sent their best reporters there, which was incredible, you know, absolutely brilliant, and a real sign of how they wanted to treat the game and women's sport going forward. And that's the benchmark now. Don't just send your women's football reporter, don't send a freelancer, don't send someone who's just graduated on work experience. Send your best team to cover what will be the best of the best in terms of women's football. There's been a lot of websites like Girls on the Ball, for example, Her Football Hub, who've been covering the game for many years, and they've built up a good reputation for reliable content and for reliable data. So let's not forget their part in it, and they are still a really worthwhile part of the game now, and they have the chance to kind of have that platform because perhaps some of the bigger players are not getting involved. They, you know, whether it's Guardian, whether it's BBC. So, you know, yes, there is a long way to go, and yes, we should have a reliable vat of information, data, stats available, but we don't. What we have is some improvements in the major players. BBC have got much better. Telegraph Women's Sport, as I said, absolutely brilliant, you know, putting dedicated money into it. But we also need to recognise some of the smaller sites and the contribution that they've made to the game and how important that is as well. And well done to them, because they've almost identified a hole in the market, I suppose, for that.
Since the conclusion of filming, a 3-year broadcasting deal has been agreed with BBC and Sky Sports, with the 2 top divisions of women's football in England, meaning a span of £24 million of investment that goes towards clubs in the WSL and in the Championship. What will this mean for the future of women's football?
She ain't good for no one, but I wanna find out the reason. Brother wanna kiss, don't even know why I'm feeling like this. I wish I did, but I don't know. Only time will tell if this thing here will last. Just to let you know I ain't concerned about your past. When it comes to you, you got me ready to give you all my love. When it comes to you, you got me ready to give you all my trust. When it comes to you, things you do be messing with my brain, yeah. Things you do be driving me insane. Shorty with the long hair, shorty with the long hair. All of my people say, brother, don't go there. She ain't good for no one. But I wanna find out the reason. Shorty with the